difference. Okay, so our learning is Lila Nishmas Mindel Mariam Bas Kama Ruvain. We're at the two dots on Ayin Tes Amud Aleph towards the about like 7 lines from the top, or on 79a2. So here we go. So the Gemara, the Mishnah told us that if a person takes out hide, it's enough kedei lasos kemiya, enough to make an amulet, right? So enough. How much hide? What's the measurement of hide? Enough to make an amulet. So ask the Gemara. Bamine Rava Mir Rav Nachman. Rava asked Rav Nachman, hamotze or bekama. If a person takes out hide, how much does he have to take out? So Amar lo kedetnan. It says in the Mishnah, or kedei lasos kemiya, enough hide to take out to make an amulet. Okay, so he asked further. Vam abdo bekama. If one tans hide on Shabbos, tanning is one of the 39 malachos. How much? What's the shear? Amar le lo shna. There's no difference. Okay. Then he asked further. La abdo bekama. Let's say a person takes out hide which has not yet been tanned. So the tanning process involves like salting and adding different things to it. So let's say he takes out some unprocessed hide. What's the measurement? Amar le lo shna. Also, there's no difference. In other words, he says anytime you're taking out hide, whatever stage you are in the process, whether it is, whether it's whether it's fully done and you are ready to write a kamiyah on it, or whether it's not yet tanned, still it's going to be the same measurement, the amount needed to write a kamiyah on. Okay, so ask the.
Why would we think that it would be a difference?
Hide
is hide.
Yeah, but one is functional to write an amulet on it, and one is not. In other words, when it's already tanned, then okay, now it's like a half step removed before writing a kamiyah. So you'd say, oh, now I get it. So this is something I'm about to write a kamiyah on, so it's going to be this measurement. But let's say if it's larger than that, and one of the svaras that we're going to be grappling with is if it's larger than that, maybe, in order for a person to start doing tanning, maybe a person wouldn't tan something so small. In other words, right, the only question is always going to be like, what's it now going to be used for? So if it's already tanned, it's already salted, so you could now you could do something with it. Oh, so it's big enough for me to write a kamiyah. Oh, it's functional. But let's say if it's not yet salted, it's not yet tanned, maybe I'm not going to go ahead and salt it because it's so small. I would only start tanning if I have a much larger amount, right? So Minat Tamer asked Rava, how do you know this? Okay, so Kediznan or Nachman replies from a different Mishnah, Hamalabed, one who whitens wool, Vamanapet, one who disentangles it, Vatzovea, one who dyes it, Vatova, one who spins it, Shiuro Kimlo Rochav Hasit Kafel. The measurement is double the width of a sit. A sit is the measurement between these two fingers if I stretch them. So a double sit is basically the amount like 2 times this size. Okay, but you see that the measurement of disentangling, dyeing, is the same as spinning it. Spinning it is the last step of that process, and the same measurement we use for spinning it is the same measurement we use for disentangling it and dyeing it, which are 2 steps along the way for this process, right? So then he just quotes the end of the Mishnah, which is not really relevant to us. One who weaves 2 threads, shiurakim lo rochav hasit, the measurement is the full width of a sit. Okay, again, that's not relevant to our discussion. Alma, but now Rav Nachman explains his proof. He says, Kivan de kai, since the raw wool stands, it's ready to be spun. Shiura kitavoy. So too, the measurement for the person who whitens it, disentangles it, or ties it is the same measurement as spinning. Hachanami here too. Kivan de abdokai shir b'mu'umad. Since you plan on using this hide to tan it, right? Therefore, its measurement is the same as tanned hide, right? It's the same idea. It's the same process. The same idea that just like with wool, you use the same measurement as what's needed for spinning, even in the earlier steps of the process. So too, we have the same measurement as the hide, which is going to be, you're going to write a kamiyah on. We say the same measurement is used even before it's tanned because it's in the stages of the process. So it's the same basic principle. Okay. Vishalola Abdu Bakama asks Rava, what if a person doesn't plan on tanning it? Amrle Loshna, it still doesn't make a difference, okay? As long as it's large enough to make an amulet, that is the measurement, okay? Ask Rava now, he starts asking some questions. You want to tell me there's no difference between hide that is tanned and hide that is not tanned? Esve, I'm going to ask you from a brisa. Hamotze samanim shruin, a person takes out steeped herbs. So in other words, you have herbs that a person now put in like a vat in hot water in order to get them ready. You're only liable if you take out enough to dye a sample swatch with them, okay? Which is the size of a weaver's bobbin. Whatever, we're not going to get into what a weaver's bobbin is, but it's a very small amount. Basically a swatch, right? If you're painting or whatever, you basically would have enough to dye that very small amount that would be used for a swatch. However, they have another Mishnah which says, regarding herbs which are not yet steeped, okay, earlier step in the process, they are not yet soaked, okay, how big? Klipe egozim and klipe ramonim, the husks of a nut or the peels of a pomegranate, satit, ufua, of safflower, or madder, different types of things which are going to be used for making dyes, in order to make a small cloth for the top of a woman's hat, which is larger than the tiny little swatch. right? So you see that different stages of processing, you see the earlier stages of the processing, it's actually much larger than the latter stage of the processing. When it's raw, these different items which are used for dyes, it's the size of the top of a woman's hat, let's say the size of my palm, okay? But when it's already soaked, then the measurement of these items is much smaller. So you do see that in the different steps of the process, right? That's what this whole discussion revolves around. At the steps of the process, is it the same measurement at the later stages, or is it different? And here you see it's larger at the earlier stages and smaller at the final stages, right? So don't tell me this whole premise that just because in one place it's the same, therefore in all places the same. You see that there are scenarios where at different stages of the process it's going to be larger and smaller. It's not the same. It's not consistent, right? That's the whole discussion here. So he says, "It's marala." And he says, "Don't ask me from there because we already have an explanation which was stated. Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rav Avua. Why is it that there's this difference? Rav Nachman, in the name of Rav Avua, explained to us. Because when it comes to steeping herbs, when it comes to soaking herbs, a person would not go ahead and start making dye that's tiny to the point that it's going to be used the size of a swatch. No one's going to do that, right? Whereas when it comes to a hide, to salt it, that is normal to do even with a small size. So basically, we're distinguishing between scenarios where we saw this svara earlier. We're going to bring up that case again, and that is that you says you're right. When it comes to the dyes, the measurement for raw dyes for the materials used to make a dye are much larger. Why? Because no one's going to ever take like one husk and make a dye for something that small. It's a whole process. It's a large process. It's not worth it. You're only going to do so with a slightly larger measurement. Whereas when it comes to tanning's an easy process, and therefore a person would even do it for a small amount, and therefore when it comes to a hide, it is going to be the same amount. When it comes to the weaving, it is going to be the same amount. But when it comes to the dyes, no one's going to bother making dyes for such a small amount. It's going to be a much larger amount when it's unprocessed, and then get smaller as the process goes along. Make sense? Yeah? So we're going to have another question. We're going to keep on having the same question, the same answer. Varei zaroni gina. What about garden seeds, where a distinction is made between planted and unplanted seeds? Before, when it's just plain seeds, it says, and we talk about carrying, the Mishnah tells us later on, zaroni gina, if a person carries out garden seeds, pachos mikrogreres, if it's less than the volume of a dried fig, according to the first opinion, it's just a little bit less than a dried fig. Rabbi Yehuda ben Masir omer chamisha, Rabbi Yehuda ben Masir says it's 5 seeds, but one way or another, you have like this measurement of seeds. However, once it's planted, another Mishnah tells us, zevel v'chol hadak, if one takes fertilizer or fine sand, you're chayav for taking out the fertilization for a single stalk of cabbage. Enough to fertilize a leek. Okay, a similar measurement, but the point is that there you see a single stalk is actually significant. Whereas when it comes to taking out the raw seeds, you have to take out like the size of a fig or 5 seeds, right? So what's going on? Again, ha'itmar Allah, amar papa, hadizriya, hodlozriya. The difference is the Mishnah, which focuses on saying a single stalk, is because it's already been planted. The fertilizer there, you already have a seed that's planted in the fertilizer, right? So your child may come home from school one day with a planter with a single stalk in it. That makes sense because that's significant already. But when it comes to seeds itself, hadilozriya, when it comes to seeds itself, then no one bothers carrying a single seed for planting. In other words, if you're going to have, if you want to give someone, again, the distinction is being made, again, between what a person would bother engaging with or not. Once something is planted, okay, then you say, oh, look, I have a pot with a single stalk growing in it. Okay, amazing. But if before it's actually planted, before it starts growing in any way, before it's planted, then no one's going to give you a single seed. You're going to give a person 5 seeds. So again, it distinguishes between what is a person going to be dealing with and what is a person not going to be dealing with. That's the basic discussion. Okay, varitit, similar discussion by Clay, and this we already saw earlier. Tanya, before it was needed. It was taught in a brisa. The brisa, we had a brisa earlier telling us that Chacham agreed when it comes to taking out wastewater, a person is only chayv they take out a revius, a measurement of revius. The Gemara asked, what is the use of the wastewater? Enough, the water is used to knead clay with it. Okay. However, after it was needed, how much clay are you chayav for carrying out? Enough to make an opening for crucible, which is a very small amount. right? So again, you see a distinction. When it comes to making the clay, it needs to be a revius of water, a very large amount. When it comes to clay that's made, we're talking about a tiny amount to cover a crucible. So Gemara says, we said the same exact answer. No one makes clay, no one's going to make clay this big. No one's going to sit there with tiny little fingers making clay that's this big. It doesn't make sense. So when you make clay, you make it with a large amount, and that's why a pre-processed clay, you're only going to be chayav if it's the raw items. It's going to be large enough that you have to mix it with a revius, a much larger amount. Once it's made, once I have clay, okay, so clay is going to be significant even in the small amounts. Just going to pause. You just understand, the basic discussion over here is when it's certain products like ore, like leather, like hide, it's a person would bother dealing with even a very small amount because it's an easy process, it's not a complicated process. You just throw some salt on it, fine. So I'm going to go ahead and even tan it, i.e. salt it, even if it's a small amount. But other items, they're not going to be seen significant in their raw state, in their pre-processed state, because it's just too much of a bother, it's just too insignificant, no one's going to bother doing so. And therefore, sometimes you'll find the measurement as exactly the same. Like with weaving, the thread is going to be the same even for at the earlier stages, or like the hide, as opposed to these other examples which we're giving over here, where in the earlier stages it's too much of a tircha, too much of a bother, and therefore you need a larger amount to be seen significant in its unprocessed or raw stage. That's the basic idea which we keep on coming back to in this discussion. Yeah? Okay.
It also is in the case of where you're taking it out into a public domain when it's Shabbos and there's no Eruv.
And that's the entire discussion is revolving. Correct. That's what we're talking about carrying. Correct. Yes. Okay, another question. Tashma, Damar Rav Chia Barami Mishmei Deula. Shlosha Orosein. There are 3 types of hides. Okay, each have a different minimum size. Okay, and what are the 3 different types of hide? One is called matzah. Okay, why is it called matzah? We'll come back to that in a moment. One is called chipa, v'diftera. Okay, and the Gemara is going to define each one and show us that each one has a different measurement. Okay, matzah kemashmo. Matzah is, why is it called matzah? It's called matzah delo maliach udelo kamiach udelo afitz, because it doesn't have flour, it doesn't have salt, and it doesn't have galnuts. Galnuts is a different type of thing which they would use. They would type of treatment, a galnut, whatever, which they would treat the hide with. So just like matzah, which is just flour and water, it doesn't have anything on it. Matzah is bland, could be bland. So similarly, that's what this hide is. Basically, it's just like you took it off the animal and you didn't put anything on it. That hide is called matzah. Just like matzah has nothing on it, so too it's called matzah for that reason. The kamashiro. What is the minimum measurement? Tani Rav Shmuel Bar Rav Yehuda Kedei Latzur Bo Mishkolas Katan, enough to wrap a small weight in it. So basically, though, they would have weights. Back in the day, to measure something, they wouldn't put on an electric scale. They put it on a scale like old school scale, and they would place a piece of metal. And in order to ensure that the piece of metal wouldn't shrink by rubbing against the scale, because it was sometimes soft metal, they would wrap it in a hide. Okay, so enough that it would cover this piece of metal. Okay, that's the minimum size. And v'kama, how large is that? Amar Abaye, riva de pumpadisa. 1/4 of a litra used in pumpadisa. Okay. Chipa de maliach. What is chipa? Chipa is the next stage. When it's treated with salt, v'lo kamiach v'lo afitz, but it doesn't have flour, doesn't have galnuts. V'kama shi'uro. And what is its measurement? K'ditznan, as we learned in our Mishnah, or if one takes out high, k'dei lasos kamiyah, it's the amount to make a kamiyah, an amulet. Diftera de maliach kamiach v'lo afitz. Diftera is when it's been treated with salt, with flour, benaya, galnuts. V'kama shi'uro. What is its measurement? On the next page. They lichtov alavas a get, enough to write a get on it. Okay, so that's the end of this of that discussion. That brisa kitani mias kidei latzud bo mishkolas kitana. What do you see? You see that at the first stage, at the matzah stage, you see it's a smaller measurement. Right? In other words, again, it says just to cover that small coin. Whereas then it says once you salt it, then it's large enough to write a kamiyah. So you see at the different stages of our whole premise of this discussion was that when it came to hides, it's going to be the same measurement at every stage of the processing because it's no big deal to process it. But now we see explicitly that at the earlier stage, it's a smaller amount. Right? And again, we said it's a very small size. So answer to Gemara, Hasam, we have to make a new kimta. We have to make an assumption. We're talking about a very particular type of leather. Hasam bevishula. There, the hide is still moist. If it's moist, right, if you want to tan something, I don't know anything about the tanning process, but I can understand, if I'm going to salt it, it's only going to make sense. The whole part of the salting process is going to make it tough, right? If it's still moist, right, after you skin it from the animal, it's still, you could imagine, it still has a little moisture. If it's still moist, you can't actually tan it. And therefore, we're talking, when do we say that it could even be smaller is when it's still moist. Because if it's still moist, I can't go through the tanning process. But if it's dry, even if it's at the earlier stage, then it is going to be the same measurement as the skin, as the hide at a later stage. Right? So the Gemara has to make it ukimta, that brisa, Max, I know you don't like ukimtas, but
it's going to end up becoming.
Okay,
right,
but right now, but I'm taking it
right.
But I'm taking it out right now. So the question is, what is it fit for doing? It's not. It's only fit for covering thing. No, that's a good question. Okay, that's not. Okay, so we learned in the Mishnah. Another question: Habeged, when it comes to tuma, habeged shlosha lemidras. That here we're talking about tuma. The minimum size of a piece of cloth is 3 tvachim by 3 tvachim. Hasak arba al arba. When it comes to sackcloth, it's 4 by 4. Ha'or chamisha al chamisha. When it comes to hide, these are the key words: 5 by 5, 5 by 5 tvachim. Mapa shisha al shisha. A mat 6 by 6 tvachim, beila midras, beila mace. Okay, and this applies to tumas midras, which is one type of tuma, and to corpse tuma. V'tani alan, a brisa was taught about that Mishnah. Habeged ve'asak ve'or kishir letuma kach shir lehotza. That the measurements that we're talking about tuma is the same measurements which we're talking about when it comes to carrying out. And what do we see over here? We see that when it comes to leather, what was the measurement? 5 by 5 tvachim, which is larger than the amount given for leather, for the kamiyah, for writing a kamiyah. And so you see this contradiction, right? So on the one hand, you're telling me that even at the earlier stages, it's a very small amount, and yet you have this Mishnah over here talking about or, and it says it's 5 by 5, which is much larger than a kamiyah. So again, you have a contradiction. Answer the Gemara, Hasam bekortovla. We're talking about boiled leather, which could only be used for making clothing or making furniture, but you can't write on it, and therefore it has its own measurements. But in a case of regular leather that has not yet been boiled, there it would be true that it's the same exact measurements of a kamiyah, whether it's already been salted or whether it's at its earlier stages. And that is the end of this entire discussion. Again, the entire discussion revolved around that same question of is it the same measurement or not at the earlier stages. And ultimately, the Gemara stands with its original assumption when it comes to hides, because it's so simple to salt it. Therefore, even in its unprocessed state, it's going to be the same as the further along the line. Whereas with other things, it's really going to depend on how significant it is at the earlier stages. Okay, fine. That's sorry for going so quick. It was basically the same type of question answer throughout the whole thing. Let's just learn a little bit of a desk. I forgot to actually bring the sefer, but the next piece he talks about a theme which comes up a lot in the works of Musar, and that is the discussion about biases. Biases. He talks about the fact that he quotes the psukim in the Torah, which says that a judge is not allowed to judge if they received a bribe. And the Gemara asks, what is a bribe? What's the measurement? Anyone know how much is considered a bribe? Shava pruta, basically the minimal amount of currency. So basically, someone gave you, if some person wanted to sell you, talk to you about the medicine that they're selling, and they followed all the legalities. They go to the doctor's office, they want to sell the doctor. Right? I don't know. There's all these changes in law about bribing the doctor, but they gave you a pen. You would not be able to judge that person's case because a pen is a bribe. Ultimately, they gave you something, and therefore you're not allowed to do that. The Gemara actually lists a story of one of a dayan who Rabbi Shmuel, I think was his name, was a Kohen, and someone came to him and wanted to give him their truma. The truma belongs to Kohen. It's something he's obligated to give to the Kohen. It's not a gift, it's an obligation. And he rejected it. He said, I can't give it to you because I know I have a court case with you later today. I'm not going to take the truma from you. And then he came to the court case and said, you know what? Because the person even offered it, they offered the gift, I'm not going to be the judge. And the Gemara says he was standing outside the court case, listening to the court case, and in his head, he felt more inclined towards that person's case, because the fact that he was offered a gift, and that in itself was enough to bribe him. And the final example that he gives, the halacha in the Gemara, which is very, very relevant for a lot of discussions. Sometimes, I'll tell you personally, sometimes a person will come to you, and they'll tell you one side of a story, right? And so you hear it, and you're like, yeah, you're right. And then, but the Gemara halachically, if you are a judge, you are not allowed to weigh in when you only hear one person. Okay, this comes up. Someone has a choshev mishpat question. A person asks you a question. You're not allowed to listen to their case without listening to both parties at once. Why? Because if I listen to one side and I might come to some conclusion at that point, then where's the bias? The bias is about myself, because it doesn't feel good to be wrong, right? Then you hear the other case. So often we hear the other side of the story, and we're like, oh, now I get it. It's a little bit more complicated, right? But then who's the bias? The bias is against myself, because I've already made my decision. It's uncomfortable for me to change that position, right? The point that all these three scenarios bring out is that we are incredibly biased. Our ability to think clearly is limited, and these halachos are all talking about judges, but as you can imagine, this is relevant to our day-to-day living. We all have, what the greatest bribe possible is my comfort, is I want to live a comfortable life. I want to live a life without friction. I want to live a life of where things are not complicated, and therefore, I'm constantly have a bias about making decisions that are going to make my life more comfortable, right? There's a bias that I have to deal with in my own personal, whenever I make a decision, I'm always making decisions that I'm not completely unbiased because I'm going to the biases. Am I going to be doing things which make things more smooth for me, which make things more favorable for me? And therefore, every time we're trying to make a quote-unquote critical decision, we have to deal with our own personal biases, our own personal comforts. And the question is, how do we, the judges could just say, recluse them, say, I'm not taking this case. What do we do? What do we do in these cases? Because every single second, we're making decisions with our own biases. How do we overcome these biases, which are natural to our life? And how do we, and again, we see how minuscule it could be that could still affect us. How could we not be affected by our biases, making critical and important decisions in our life? God willing, we'll come back to that in the days to come. Have a great day.